Hello, and welcome back to another Village Torah session with me, your host, Rabbi Drew. We are talking about this week's Torah portion, and this week's Torah portion is Lekh Lekha. This is the third Torah portion in the book of Genesis. So, in this one, we actually start off with a story about Abraham. So, the way this Torah portion starts off, it focuses on Abraham, although it is worth noting that even though we call him Abraham, and his name does ultimately get changed to Abraham, he starts off with the name of Avram. Now, what we see here, God speaks to him, Vayomer Adonai el Avram Lekh Lekha. The Lord said to Avram, go forth, go for you. Mi artzacha umi moladetecha umibeit avicha, from your native land, your father's house, actually from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house, el haaretz asher areka, to the land I will show you. Okay, so you're supposed to go, and that those two words, they are two separate words. Lekh lecha, go forth for yourself. They sound pretty similar, different words. And then what we see is God continuing to speak to Avram. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. Conversely, God continues, I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. And Avram went forth as the Lord had commanded him, and Lot went with him. Lot is his nephew. Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Okay, and then we can keep going. But for our purposes, I really wanted to focus on sort of this setting, and then we're going to get into a little bit of a deeper dive into what is going on here for Avram. Now, it does seem kind of as if Avram comes out of nowhere. He was not a big player. And actually, we do get an introduction to Avram in last week's Torah portion in just the very tail end, as we will see right here. The very tail end of last week's Torah portion, we see that Terach had lived 70 years old. So Terach is Nahor's son, and there's a whole listing of generations. I'm not going to go through that now. You are very welcome to go and check out what's going on in the chapter 11 of the book of Genesis, and to read the entire various generations going on. But so we have Terach. Okay, so when he had lived 70 years old, he begot Avram, Nahor, and Haran. So these three sons, Avram, Nahor, Haran. Very nice. So that's Avram's introduction. It's through his father. And now this is the line of Terach. We have Terach begot Avram, as I mentioned before, Nahor, and Haran begot Lot. Now, it is possible, I just will parenthetically include in here, the reason this is specifying that Haran begot Lot, Haran might have had other children, and Nahor might have also have had other children. We don't know. It is clearly important, Lot being born, because he's going to appear in this week's Torah portion. Now, what we see is that Haran died in the lifetime of his father. So he still was able to father Lot, but he still died while his father was still alive. And he died in the native land, in the land of his birthplace, in Ur Kasdim. Now, Ur Kasdim, we'll get to in a little bit, but Ur sounds a lot like Ur, a fiery place of some place. We'll get to that in a little bit. And then Avram and Nahor took wives for them. The name of Avram's wife being Sarai, and just a spoiler alert, ultimately Sarai, her name will be changed to Sarah. So Avram and Sarai are married. They will eventually become Avraham and Sarah. But that's just a little bit of a looking ahead. And Nahor's wife is Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Okay, that's nice. And they don't seem to be important narratively here. It's nice to get who is part of this family tree. Okay. Now, Sarai was barren, and she had no children. Okay. And Terach took his son Avram, his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Avram, and they set out together from Ur Kasdim for the land of Canaan. But when they had come as far as Haran, they settled there. Now, so it's Terach, it's Avram, it's Lot, and it's Sarai. So it's the four of them. Presumably just the four of them. We don't know if there are other people, but as the text describes it for us, it's just those four. And to close out this 11th chapter, right before we get to the beginning of our Torah portion this week, the days of Terach came to 205 years, and Terach died in Haran. Okay. Very nice. He died in Haran. It's interesting. He died in Haran, but he had a son named Haran. Two different names, but that's where he died. Okay, that's lovely. That's the way we close it out. And then, so that's what we know about Avram before we get to what we see at the very outset of this week's Torah portion. Here is what is interesting. Well, we don't know how old. One of the curious things is the Torah text here, the text of the book of Genesis, and it's certainly not in the conclusion of this 11th chapter in Genesis, does not tell us how old. I take that back. Okay, so Terach was 70 years old when he had these three sons. Now, it is a little funny when we think about it. What do you mean? He just popped out all three sons the same year? It's not clear. Maybe it's maybe by the time he had reached the age of 70, he had all three. A little bit unclear. I will admit it's a little bit unclear. But Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Oh, yes. Okay. So this is actually juicy here. Okay. We just mentioned at the end of chapter 11 that Terach lived to be 205 years old, and he died in Haran. But then we see in this fourth verse of our Torah portion this week that Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Okay, so that's really fascinating, because if his father gave birth to him, whether at 70 years old or by 70, either way, that means when Avram left, if we're going to take what we just read in the 11th chapter, that means his father was 140 years old with still another 65 years left to live before finally expiring in Haran. Very interesting, because just a plain read of what we saw here at the very end of last week's Torah portion, at the very end of chapter 11 of Genesis, it would seem that Terach died, and then Abraham's given this charge by God. Hey, go, leave, go forth for yourself. But actually, when we think about this math, when we think about these numbers, it turns out that his father is still very much alive and will still live another 65 years. So he really does leave, and he leaves from his land, his birthplace, and more importantly, Beit Avicha, from his father's house. So he really does leave from his father's house. His father's still alive and well when he decides to leave. Okay, so having seen some of those, I want to touch on something I introduced last year, and that's something I've been talking about in the interval in over the past year, which is this concept or this we can call it a tool, this fun little thing called midrash. Now, I've mentioned midrash before, but I just want to take a moment to iterate what it is, to go back over it. Midrash, well, first of all, the root of it means to inquire, to seek, of drosh. What I like to think of it as rabbinic narrative expansion. So they take a story and they pull it apart and they see what else is going on. They want to know what else is going on, especially, I think it really comes to the fore right here with Avram, because when you think about it, there seems to be a lot more going on beneath the words of the text. There's a lot more. And certainly if someone were describing events in your life or anybody's life, this is an incredibly terse, very dry narrative, and so much more is going on. And so the rabbis, I just want to focus on one particular midrash about Avram, because There are plenty, especially even just within this week's Torah portion. There's certainly many, 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 but I want to actually discuss perhaps one of the most, I want to say most popular, most famous of these midrashim about Avram, and even just within this Torah. It's certainly one of the most, I would say, popular or famous, not only midrashim in this week's Torah portion about Avram, it's probably one of the most famous midrashim about Avraham anywhere in the Torah. So this comes from a collection of rabbinic midrash called Bereshit Rabbah, or Genesis Rabbah. And we have with this line of Haran dying in the face of his father Terach. So Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Chia is an early 3rd century rabbi. If you just wanted to figure out how long ago did this Rabbi Chia live? Oh, interesting. The English translation doesn't include his. Interesting. It's actually in the Hebrew. It says Rabbi Chia bar Brei de Rav Ada Diafo. So it's Rabbi Chia, the son of Rav Ada from Jaffa. Okay, I'm not exactly sure when he lived. Rabbi Chia, the regular Rabbi Chia, is an early 3rd century rabbi. This I've never been introduced to this rabbi before. Okay, so what does he say about Avram? He says, Terach. Okay, remember Terach is Avram's father. Terach was a manufacturer of idols. He created idols. He made them. He once went away somewhere and left Avram to sell them in his place. A man came in and wished to buy one. How old are you? Avram asked the man. 50 years old, this man said. Whoa. So then Avram says to him, woe to such a man who is 50 years old and would worship a day-old object. Avram said, okay, that story doesn't continue. Presumably the man walked away with such terrible customer service. On another occasion, a woman came in with a plate full of flour and requested him, take this and offer it to them. So he took a stick and broke them. I guess he just, took a stick of some sort and just went throughout the entire, think about this. It's his father's shop. This is his livelihood. This is what he's manufacturing. He takes this stick and just goes throughout his entire father's shop and just breaking everything. Except for put the stick in the hand of the largest. So he let the largest idol remain standing, but broke all of the other idols in his father's shop. Would you imagine that his father came back happy? I don't think anybody would. When his father returned, he demanded, what have you done to them? I cannot. So Avram responded, I cannot conceal it from you. A woman came with a plate full of fine meal and requested me to offer it to them. One claimed, I must eat first, while another claimed, I must eat first. Presumably, they kept saying, I must eat first. I must eat first. Okay. Thereupon, the largest amongst those idols arose, took the stick, and broke them. So Terach responds, why do you make fun of me? Do they have any knowledge? Terach said. So Avram gives it back to him. Should not your ears hear what your mouth has said? So clearly, Abraham is trying to show how incredibly illogical what Terach is doing. And presumably, I'm going to go ahead and assume that Terach is not creating these idols in a cynical fashion just to make them for livelihood, that he actually makes them because he himself believes in the efficaciousness of idol worship. So Abraham here is saying there is a really huge illogicality. A lot of this does not make sense. How could it be that, okay, so I busted them all up. He's not really admitting to them, but he's saying, look, Father, you're telling me that they don't have any knowledge, they can't do anything. And so Abraham's saying, you're saying that, but are the words going in your own head? If they have no knowledge, if they have no agency, if they can't do anything, so why bother worshiping them? That won't get you anywhere. Okay. It's so then instead of responding, instead of actually responding, Terach is clearly just simply upset. So thereupon, Terach seized him, and delivered him to Nimrod. We don't, okay, Nimrod, nice. So Nimrod said, let us worship fire. So Abraham clearly, at least in this telling of this midrash, he's a wise guy. He is a wise guy, but he's clever. He's very clever. So Abraham says, well, let us worship water. Nimrod said, let us rather. So clearly now they're one-upping each other. The reason Abraham is saying, let us worship water, because, I'm sorry. Let us rather worship water which quenches fire. So that's what Abraham says. So why bother with fire? There's something that is more powerful than that. So Nimrod said, let us worship water. Then Abraham, getting really clever, says, let us rather worship the clouds which bear the water. Okay, this is now getting a little absurd. And I think anybody hearing or otherwise reading this story understands the absolute the absurdity of this claim. So then Nimrod agrees with Abraham. Let us then worship the clouds. Now, at this point, I have to stop and say this is really amusing. Nimrod here has clearly a very different approach in his discussing with Abraham. With his father, between Abraham and Terach. So Abraham, fairly clever, and Terach has no response. He cannot respond. Abraham is, possessing a lot of logic. Here with Nimrod says, "Oh, you're right. We should worship the water." And Abraham went up to him. Let's worship the clouds. Let's worship the clouds. That's fine. Okay. So, So Nimrod said, "Then fine. Let's worship the clouds." Sounds good, Abraham. Abraham responds, let us worship the wind, which disperses the clouds. Nimrod says, let us worship the wind. Abraham responds, let us worship human beings, which can stand up to the wind. So now Nimrod has had it at this point. He knows how ridiculous this is, and he's had it. He says, you are just bandying words, and we will worship nothing but the fire. Okay, all of your arguments, Abraham, they're ridiculous. We're just going to go back to worshiping fire. That's it. Fire. We're going to worship fire. Okay, fine. Behold, I will cast you into it. Now he's getting serious. Okay, there's a real threat on the table. I'm going to throw you into the fire, and behold, I will cast you into it, and let your God, whom you adore, come and save you from it. That's very nice. You want to say that human beings who are stronger than the wind, who are stronger than the clouds, who are stronger than the water that can quench the fire, you think humans stand atop all of this powerfulness way above fire? I'm going to put you, a human being, into that fire, and we'll see. Does your beloved God actually help you? Okay. Now Haran was standing there undecided. Clearly, Haran came along for the ride. Haran's been around. Haran's still here. Okay. He was standing there undecided. Now, clearly, by the way, this, we'll see. This is clearly taking place within. This is right before what we see in Lekh Lekha, but this is at the end of that 11th chapter, the very bare end of last week's Torah portion. So Haran was standing there undecided. He thought, if Abraham is victorious, I will say that I am of Abraham's belief. While if Nimrod is victorious, I will say that I am on Nimrod's side. So it seems he's a fair weather fan. Like he's not really sure who to throw his lot in with. So when Abraham descended into the fiery furnace and was saved, Nimrod asked him, of whose belief are you? So he was right. So first of all, let's go back into this line. When Avram descended into the fiery furnace, so they did end up tossing Avram into that fire, into the fiery furnace, and he lived. I do have to say, it's I don't think it's really spelled out here, but it is actually. Okay, so it's not spelled out, but what they do is I think there's this older midrash. I think this is working off of it. What is this fiery furnace? Where do they get the notion that there's a fiery furnace? I mentioned earlier that they were in this place called Ur of Kasdim, right? Now this Ur of Kasdim is okay. It's in verse 31 here in chapter 11. They set out together from Ur Kasdim, but when they um, okay, here we go. It goes back to what we see in chapter 11, verse 28, that Haran died in the lifetime of his father in the land of his birthland of Ur Kasdim. Now, Ur Kasdim, okay, I mentioned earlier, Ur sounds a lot like an ore, a fire. So maybe ores and a fire, they would say it's a furnace. And what is this furnace of the Kasdim? Okay, the Kasdim are a people. So it's in the fire of these particular people. And so that's what this midrash is working off of. That what happened in Ur Kasdim and what about Haran dying there? Well, maybe all these things in the same verse are tied together. That Haran died in a fiery accident. Okay, so that is what this midrash is picking up on. That it's not just some random incident. There was something really specific going on, and it's actually very notable, especially here in Avram's development and sort of the story of everybody going on. So that's what this furnace is about. So that's what they're talking about. That Nimrod threw Avraham into this fiery furnace, and then was saved. So then Nimrod asked him, "Of whose belief are you?" So he was right. He was worried that he would be asked, "Choose a side," and he is. He is being asked by Nimrod, who asks him, "Of whose belief are you?" So he says, "Of Avram's. My brother was tossed into this fire and he lived. I can do this too." Thereupon he seized him and cast him into the fire. His innards were scorched and he died in the presence of his father, which, by the way, is the specific language used in the chapter 11. Hence it is written, Haran died in the presence of his father, Terach. And by the way, it's actually it's even more fascinating language used in the Hebrew, which isn't simply they died in the presence. It's all panei terach. It's in his face, right? It's in his face. He sees it. It's not just in his presence that he happened to be there, but it's literally in his face. And that's also what, and we see that in chapter 11 here. Vayamat Haran al Panei Terach Aviv, that he died in his father's face, that it's something that was very visible, that was something very evident for his father. That is one midrash working with this story here at the very end of chapter 11, but it does a couple of things. Of course, one is it plays with this notion of Haran dying in the face of his father in Ur Kasdim. There was a furnace, and this is the story that Haran didn't just simply die, but he died having to do with this test of faith of Avraham. And Avraham is clearly contesting this sort of widespread notion of idolatrous worship or worshiping idols. So that's something that Avraham is clearly not okay with. And that's something that makes him stand out. It's explaining why Haran dies. That's the Ur Kasdim, right? This fiery furnace or this Chaldean furnace. And then it's also going to set up what makes Avram special. Because we don't see anything in this text. If we were to go back and look at the end of chapter 11, setting up Avraham and what little description we've gotten of him in the end of chapter 11, we don't get really much that's special about Avraham. He's a guy. Okay. He married a lady. He married Sarai. Okay. His father's Terach. That's nice, but nothing special. Really, he's just like anybody else. So this midrash, and there are definitely other midrashim out there as well. This midrash really tries to point out something that is different about Avram. This is something that makes him stick out, and also why he would be willing to hear the voice of God. That he was not an idol worshiper like everybody else. He was different. He believed in God. He believed in just one God and not a multiplicity of different gods, unlike his father, right? And that also sets up why in the very beginning of this week's Torah portion, it says to leave your father's house. It's not simply the geographical location of leaving your father's house, but it's also cultural, right? The intellectual culture, the ways of thinking. Leave that. Go for yourself. Do it for you. So that's just an explanation of one particular midrash. There are definitely some other ones about Avraham I will say that seems to be a fun little pastime of the rabbis, coming up with these narrative expansions, these midrashim, about what made Abraham special. Because Abraham didn't do we don't see in the biblical text that Abraham necessarily did anything to acquire a certain place or level. And yet the rabbis say, no, 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 he was different. He was special. There were things that he did to merit such attention from God. And this is one such midrash about Avraham. So with that, I hope this is insightful, was informative, fun. And with that, I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.